Lesson planning can be extremely complicated and tedious. And then to actually plan through a UDL lens, it could be like adding one new thing. And I want to share with you a simple way to plan accessible lessons with UDL without adding a whole bunch of work to your plate. So let's talk about this. So, one of the things that we do when we're creating lessons is we usually start with some type of goal, right? And that's usually what we want students to know or do. And typically, in order to measure whether students have achieved that goal, we have an assessment. And that could be something as simple as a formative assessment, like an exit ticket at the end of class, or something a little bit more complicated like a summative assessment at the end of a chapter. So, between the goal and actually accomplishing that goal, well, there's usually some high probability barriers that exist. And there's generally three different types of barriers that we have to plan for when we're designing lessons. And that is how things are represented, how students engage, and then how students demonstrate their understanding or action expression. Those sort of correspond with the three principles of UDL. So when we're starting to plan our lesson, what we can do is we can start looking for methods and materials and assessments that are flexible and actually meet the goals that we're talking about. So how does this actually work? So I put together a flowchart. And so this flowchart asks you 6 questions to ask yourself when designing a UDL lesson. So first of all, you want to ask yourself, what exactly is the type of academic standard that I'm using? Is it a content standard or is it a method standard? And this is important because content standards measure knowledge, right? And so you'll see verbs like explain, describe, paraphrase, compare, contrast. And here's an example of one: communicate the ideas of stars over the scientific ideas about the way stars over their life cycle produce elements. Well, there's many different ways that we can show what we know in meeting this particular standard. So content standards are really good for providing flexibility in how we assess students. But method standards, on the other hand, are specific skills that students need to demonstrate. And sometimes we don't have a whole lot of flexibility with that. We have to write, calculate, draw, measure. And so we might have to be flexible in how we go about that particular task. So when we know the standard and whether it is a content standard or a method standard, we might want to start thinking about, okay, unpacking this standard. Like, what exactly does this mean? And so there are all sorts of different tools. You could use your own knowledge, or if you wanted to use a tool like Magic School, you really could. And so this is a free AI tool that you can use. It's also a paid version as well, that I can go right here and I can add any type of academic standard I'm working with from any grade level. I'm going to show you the exemplar here, and this is a social studies standard, and you can see that it breaks it down by key components, expectations, learning targets, assessment strategies, and even provides a summary. So this helps us get a clear understanding of, okay, what exactly are we trying to do? Standards are sort of like the compass, the direction that we want to go in, and goals are like the address, right? We want to actually get to a specific location. So the next thing is designing a learning goal. And when you're designing a learning goal, you want it to be clear. And there are all sorts of different ways to create clear learning goals. I, in fact, created this document here on 10 tips for building better learning goals. And so making it measurable, avoid prescribing how you do it, even connecting with learners and giving learners opportunities to connect with the goal is extremely important. So not only do you have that, but you also have this, well, litmus test that you can ask yourself when you're designing a goal. And that is, what do you want students to know or do? And then why do you want them to learn it? And how will you know if they've learned it? That can really help you design better learning goals. Well, the next thing that you'd want to do is you'd want to start thinking in terms of how you will assess your learners. So going back to that graphic, which we said a few minutes ago, here's the goal. Like, how are we actually going to achieve it? So when we do something like that, we can start thinking in terms of a doctor, right? So are we going to have an assessment for the teacher, or is it for the student? And either one is quite okay depending on what your learning goal is. So assessments for learning are generally assessments for the teacher, right? And so what we do is we start thinking in terms of, okay, how are students doing with this particular topic? Like, are there different ways that we can sort of get students talking about the lesson, what they've learned, and then make any changes to instruction that we may need? So, exit tickets are great, 1 minute papers, but even doing something as simple as a sketch note or even just having a conversation with students is really helpful. So that's one way that you can look at helping students as an assessment for learning. But other times we have summative assessments, and this is for the students, right? An assessment of learning. It's to help understand, did students master all of the content? Are they ready to move on to the next unit or chapter? And so there are all sorts of different ways that we can do that. In fact, I have this 10 assessments of learning document here that has, well, some alternatives to just a simple quiz or test. You can do all sorts of different things depending on what your learning goal is all about. So then what we do is we start looking for potential obstacles. And I have an acronym that I like to use to help me plan a PD or a lesson, and it's called POP, right? POP. And the first P stands for predict. And what we're doing is we're predicting obstacles or high probability barriers that are going to occur. So you might have recently taught a lesson and students just didn't get something. So you're like, ah, man, yeah, next time I run that lesson, I'm going to have to plan for this or this. Or there's a topic that you know that students are going to struggle with. That's an example of predicting high probability barriers. The other thing that we can think about too is think about variability. All learners are different, so what are their needs and differences? So thinking in terms of maybe one or two to start off with can be really helpful. You're not going to predict every single barrier that's possibly going to happen, but this gives you a good way of being proactive in your design. So there are some different tools right here that you can use. One of the most helpful tools are the UDL guidelines. So the UDL guidelines are going to be changing in July of 2024. So this is the 2.0 version of the UDL guidelines. So we're going to use this to help illustrate our example. So you can use the UDL guidelines as sort of a flowchart of coming up with barriers. So in terms of thinking like this. So, all right, my lesson. Are students going to be engaged with this lesson? Well, they might struggle a little bit with engagement. And what specifically are they going to struggle with? Well, recruiting interest is going to be something that's really difficult. Like, it's just a boring topic. As you go through and you're teaching the lesson and you're representing things, are there anything that's going to get in the way? And you might say, oh, yeah, you know what? It's very heavy on vocabulary. So language is going to be a potential barrier. So knowing those sort of things is extremely helpful because then what we can do is we can start looking for opportunities. And so when we're looking for opportunities for proactive and accessible design, we start looking at some of the strategies that we might have in our toolbox to help address this. Or we might even want to start looking at potential scaffolds and supports or even accessibility tools to help all learners access learning. So going back to that example, we had said that, well, recruiting interest could be it's something that students will struggle with. So when I open this guideline up, what's really helpful with the UDL guidelines is they provide these checkpoints. And so it's almost like tips and tricks for helping recruit student interest through brain science, right? So this is actually proven through neuroscience to work. So optimizing choice and autonomy might actually be a great thing that we could do. And here are some different strategies, but you might say, well, you know what? I've done this or I've done that, and I've actually had success with, say, choice boards, or I've had success with collaborative projects. Well, start planning those things to overcome those obstacles. Another thing that we can think about is this idea of being flexible in the product or process. A lot of times we can create opportunities by providing choice, but there's not always choice available to all of our students. So I'm going to give you this graphic here, and this graphic is flexibility in the product or flexibility in the process. So like I mentioned earlier, there are different types of content standards or knowledge that students need to know. And when you have a content standard, you might actually develop a goal sort of like this: explain the three major causes of the American Revolutionary War. Now, because this is such a flexible goal, well, we have some structured choices for students to demonstrate their understanding. And that's key, providing structured choice. Research shows us that between 2 and 4 is the sweet spot for learning. So we don't want to just say you can do whatever you want if we've never offered choice before. So here are some different ideas. We could create a presentation, multimedia presentation, or even an essay, right? But sometimes we don't have that flexibility, and that's where sometimes we get stuck. We might have a method standard or skills that students need to demonstrate. So in this particular example, students have to write an essay. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. They have to write the essay. However, we might be able to provide students with flexible options in the process of writing that essay. For example, we might give them some different tools for brainstorming. They might use post-it notes or a graphic organizer. When they're constructing the essay, we might provide them with a template, or perhaps we allow them to use text-to-speech tools or just a Google Doc. When we get to the point where students need feedback, perhaps we use a tool like Grammarly or peer feedback. A peer feedback choice board by Caitlin Tucker is amazing. You might want to use that. Or even just having a one-on-one meeting with the teacher. So when we can design for ways to have opportunities for proactive and accessible design, then we just start planning our lesson. And remember, your lesson, you want to start thinking about methods that you're using and materials that you're using, and designing assessments in a way that are going to meet the needs of all learners. Once again, it really depends on your goal. And as a bonus tip, you might even want to try adding Castle's 3 signature practices and getting an SEL component. So let's just recap what we just talked about. So we talked about this idea of when you start a lesson, it usually begins with some type of goal, right? And usually we want to measure that goal through an assessment. But sometimes what gets in the way are high probability barriers, and they usually come in the form of engagement, how things are represented, or how students demonstrate their knowledge through action and expression. What we can do is we can begin to predict those high probability barriers or obstacles, and then we can look for ways to overcome them with flexible materials and methods. So that's why we designed this particular UDL lesson planning flowchart. It begins with the standard, transitions to your goal, and then it starts coming up with what's your plan to assess students. And then let's start thinking in terms of obstacles and opportunities. And then let's start planning our lesson.